Welcome everyone to this Summit on Vulnerability to Resilience. We have 5 expert panelists to share their thoughts with us on the subject. So to save time for our panelists, I'm just going to do a brief introduction of each. We have first panelist, Dr. Paul Wong, Professor Emeritus of Trent University, our founder and president of INPM. Dr. Piers, visiting professor in psychology at Buckinghamshire New University. Dr. Blaine Fowers, professor of counseling psychology at University of Miami. Dr. Darcia Narvaez, professor of psychology emerita at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Claude-Hélène, professor in industrial and organizational psychology at the University of Johannesburg. And so it is, we do have 5 panelists. I am just gonna have Paul kick off the presentation.
I'd like to welcome you to this summit symposium. From vulnerability to resilience. And this is the main conference theme. And we're so happy to have several experts on this topic to give us their perspectives. I hope that we can have a free and honest exchange of ideas, and we also welcome participants to submit their questions so that we can have a fruitful, productive session. Now, how about this picture? Paradise Lost and the forbidden fruit. Sadly speaking, human story is one of vulnerability, but it's also one of redemption and resilience. Now, most people's knee reaction to the word vulnerability is a negative one. They equate that with weaknesses. But we should remember that we are all mortals. We're all mortals. We're not God. We all need a boundary of forbidden fruit to remind us who we are. Every time we cross the invisible line and try to play God, disaster strikes. And so much human suffering results from the fact that we forget that we are mere mortals, fragile and vulnerable mortals. And in fact, I think that the present pandemic is the result of us violating some boundary. Okay. Now, what's the connection between vulnerability and resilience? My hypothesis is that vulnerability is essential for our resilience. For example, we know that any trauma or any adversity can either break you or make you stronger. Now, all depends how we respond. Can you think about what is the best way to be resilient? I propose that it's not strength per se, but as Taoism claims, Lao Tzu taught us, be like water. Water is weak, look like weak and soft, but water can overcome and defeat anything. Now, the first point I want to share with everyone is that vulnerability is an existential reality. No one is immune from it. Death is only a breath away. Those people who think they are invulnerable and they refuse to take vaccine, sooner or later, they might die from COVID-19. In fact, every action we take, when we reach out our hand to make friends, when we speak in front of people, what do we do? We run the risk of rejection and failure. If we try to avoid vulnerability, we end up become prisoners of our fear. We have no life. So all the good things in life are on the other side of fear. We'll be vulnerable, willing to be vulnerable in order to enjoy a full life, in order to become resilient. So therefore, Brené Brown, she has made a lot of contributions in this area. She said, you know what? It's wrong to view vulnerability as weaknesses. Vulnerability is actually the birthplace of joy, belonging, creativity, authenticity, and love. Because if you are afraid, you never find true love. You never experience success. Look at the joy of the Olympic champions. Look at the excitement, the joy in winning. But they're able to have that only after they are willing to be vulnerable to failure, to despair, and to getting hurt, to injury. And Apostle Paul said that my weakness is my strength. I say the same thing. Whenever I'm weak, I become strong. Do you know why? Because my vulnerability, my weakness keep me humble. I cannot start a day without humbly asking for God's help, God's guidance. I can't go through the day without begging other people for help. I will beg my little assistant team to help me with technical stuff. I will ask my wife to open a jar because my hands are too weak. I can't go through a day without making myself vulnerable and humbly asking for help. So I say that faith, hope, and love, they all come from awareness of vulnerability. So I'm currently working on a vulnerability awareness scale. I want to investigate whether a healthy sense of vulnerability is a good predictor of resilience, mental health, and mental happiness. Now, having said that, faith, hope, love, these are essential internal resources. Okay? But there's some other things we can also learn. The first one is blocked. Okay? It's courage. I think it's courage, acceptance. When you courage, when you acceptance, when you self-transcendence, we need to look at everything as meaningful, We need to appreciate other people's help, and we need to have compassion. Now, people often say compassion means weakness. Compassion, that means you always say yes. But sometimes compassion requires tough love, requires surgery. Compassion is not incompatible with doing the right thing. So if we're able to have all these things, we can be vulnerable every day, but still we can live a productive and flourishing life. I'm sure my distinguished colleagues can contribute to this subject. So now I yield the time to my panelists.
We will now have Dr. Piers speak first.
Well, thank you. And I say it's a pleasure to be here from a summer's evening in Great Britain, United Kingdom. I want to talk from an example. I want to work out some things about vulnerability from an example. I'm not saying I've got it all right. I'm not saying I'm catching everything. Yet I want to explore via an example. Because to me, you see vulnerability as a doorway, and it's a two-way doorway. If we are in some of the best areas of life, I think at the same time, we're also vulnerable. And if we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we also give ourselves permission for some of the best in life. Now, I want to give an example of this by describing how a colleague and I created an educational program with vulnerability at its core. So let me tell you a bit about the background. 10 years ago, I wrote and launched a master's in applied positive psychology with a colleague. We were comfortable in knowing we had leading content. So we made a choice, and that was to ask students to explore each subjects in seminars and assignments from their own personal goals. So we were not essentially using assignments to test their understanding of content. We were saying, go and explore from what is important for you. We were confident in the content to be taught, that we could be flexible enough to adjust seminars and assignments to the goals of the students. So initially, these choices were made at what I would call the task and the learning level. And at the time, we actually didn't know some of the implications of what we'd set in motion, because it was an unusual experience for students to be given a choice of where they focus their work and staff support in studying what mattered most for them. We would find it normally took about a semester for students to settle into the freedom we gave them. Some did not accept freedom and work conventionally. Most did. But as I think, we might see and agree that in vulnerability, there is a vulnerability in freedom. So witnessing them change and giving the space to explore what mattered to them, certainly the perception from the outside was we started to see them thrive in freedom and choice. My perception, the students became teachers of each other. That's an extraordinary point to make. Teachers of each other because they specialized in their own areas of priority and focus. Now, those of you familiar with the work of Carl Rogers will know that he wrote a book called Freedom to Learn. What I'd forgotten is I read that book 25 years ago, 30 years ago, forgot I'd read it. And actually every aspect of freedom to learn, I feel, appeared in the course we created. Now, it was fascinating as the students also started to live and show what they experienced this freedom giving them. because they were accepted for their own goals and who they are. They were supported openly by staff and fellow students. And in being accepted and free, the appearance was they started to grow. There were a lot of signs that this was experienced by them as an expression or a form of love, or receiving love. And the will to be ourselves also creates the sense of vulnerability. Yet the way of working and living had consequences beyond my initial expectations. When I walked into the teaching room at the end of the first year, a student didn't even pause to say, "Hello, Piers, how are you?" There was an immediate "Piers," and a question thrown at me: "Is vulnerability a strength?" Now, I did what I would always do and say, "Well, perhaps you'd like to answer your own question." And she said, "Yes, it is." So at that point, I described my own experience. And I said to them, "What do you think it feels like to teach you as a group, never knowing what's about to happen when I walk in the door, never knowing what you'll explore and learn?" Teaching them was living vulnerability, because it was living not knowing, trusting that I and we could in some way respond to what they most wanted to learn and live, and support them in that process. So having watched 8 cohorts before I retired 2 years ago, I'd say 3 words were the essence of that experience. They are acceptance of the students, support for the students, love for the students. And in that, they visibly thrived and flourished. Now, part of what I'm saying and working out in this example is, to me, vulnerability is a process. There is an embedded process in being vulnerable. My perception of that comes from different places. Rollo May, in his book called A Way of Being, said we rarely truly see another person because we bring our own constructs, our own habits or perceptions to what they might be like. So truly seeing them meant letting go of our habits of perception. Carl Rogers put forward the core conditions of growth, being empathy, unconditional positive regard, which we offered our students, but at the same time congruence in ourselves. And Eric Fromm really touched me to an extraordinary level in saying the deepest expression of love is to support the other person being and becoming who they truly are. Now, so this to me was the process of living and being vulnerable. I had a sense it was a timeless process, that it might work at any age, many ages, any ages, maybe developmental. Now, I'd also say living that way wasn't and isn't easy, because increasing numbers of students, my colleague and I, started to experience higher levels of anxiety in our acceptance of the vulnerability of the teaching process. So we needed to develop coping and self-care to maintain the offering of higher levels of vulnerability. It involved a lot of trust, a trust of them and a trust of myself and my colleague. So I'm saying, for me, vulnerability is a process, not content, to cope with the sheer variety of what happens in the educational context, and in fact, to me, in any context. In the educational context, I'd say we didn't always get it right, yet the process conveyed the intent. So even if when we wobbled in it, essentially people gave us latitude because they were seeing what we were doing. So to finish the example, or the working through the example, I'd say, to me, vulnerability, working from a place of openness that is vulnerable, is living deeply, it's meeting the other person deeply and accepting the other person deeply. And from my own positive psychology background, the person I would relate that back to would be Barbara Fredrickson's work on what she called Love 2.0, which said this was also an expression and a form of love. So what I've tried to do is illustrate vulnerability as part of a working process, opening to others, and essentially coping with the interaction that results. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Worth. Now we have Dr. Fowers.
Okay, so I guess I'm not able to share my slides with you, so I'll be looking at them on my computer and talking you through them. First of all, let me say thank you to Paul for inviting me to participate in this symposium and to be part of this conference. I'm very pleased to be here. The title of my remarks is Allowing Our Humanity to Shine Forth Through Inevitable Suffering. So I'm going to be focusing similar to what Paul focused on in terms of vulnerability primarily. In some ways, I'd like to, I'm not a big fan of the term resilience, so because it tends to be a bit reactive. And so I like to focus more on how we deal with vulnerability, and that there are some resources that I find in Neo-Aristotelian theory. Aristotle has been my guide in this. So that's the perspective from which I'm going to share. And the idea being that we can always respond to situations. It doesn't have to be a terrible situation like a pandemic or a disease or the loss of a loved one. This is something that is part of our everyday life. And the first point of this is the obvious one, that suffering can't be eliminated. Okay, I'm getting the request to share my screen, but I am unable to. The host has disabled participant screen sharing. So I'll just continue to work from my slides. But what's interesting is in the modern West, reducing suffering has become a huge preoccupation. We've actually become quite expert in it. We reduce it through technological advancement, medical care, distractions such as entertainment, and so forth. So we're very, very good at it. And it causes us to sometimes miss the fact that suffering is part of everyday life. Now, the ancient Greeks were very good at recognizing this. And in fact, they would talk about our way of life as being filled with hubris, that we think that we're invulnerable and beyond loss, disappointment, and pain, which are part of everyday life. And we know this very implicitly because everyone that we love, there will be some loss involved. We will lose everyone we love. Our maturity, it's a great accomplishment, but it requires we lose our innocence, much of our innocence. Aspirations, the projects we undertake, the things we want to accomplish, inevitably include failures and frustrations. And growth is, as wonderful as it is, it makes us vulnerable. So these are almost tautological realities for us as human beings. I have an example that's very personal to me, and that is that last weekend, I had the privilege of spending the whole, an extended weekend with my 2 adult children, their partners, and my partner. And it was one of the best things that's ever happened to me, one of the best weekends of my life. And so it was very joyous for me. But throughout the time, I knew the weekend would end. I knew that this time together could only last so long. I could carry it with me as a memory, but I was going to have to face the loss of this very treasured time. So it's just a small example of how loss and disappointment and so forth are just built into even the very best things. They're not something we can avoid. What I'd like to talk about is a little bit about a young woman named Melissa Atman. She was like many college students and was living very well, was 2 weeks from graduation, and she found herself with a person who decided to end her life. She was brutally murdered on May 5th, 1995. Her parents, Lynn and Michael Atman, were destroyed by this, of course, as any parents would be. And in the year following their gradually beginning to put their life back together, they founded what's called the Melissa Institute in Miami, Florida, in 1996. And it's been devoted to community violence prevention, and they do a lot of training and outreach in order to accomplish that. And I think it's a great example of what I'm going to call transformative suffering. They suffered a grievous loss. In fact, the quote from them is that when Melissa was murdered, our world was shattered and our lives forever changed. With the support of family and friends, we have turned our pain into positive action through the Melissa Institute. We know the pain of violence and its impact on society. Working together, we have made our society a better place for everyone, especially our children. However, the more we accomplish, the more we realize how much work remains. Together, we are making a difference. So the Atmans took their tragedy, this terrific loss that they experienced, and turned it into something that honored their daughter's memory. And they have been doing this for over 25 years. I met them at one of their conferences recently, and they immediately told me their story. That was the first thing on their mind, that I understand what the Institute was about. So then the question comes, does suffering make us powerless? And I think we all know that the answer to that question is no. Even though we cannot wholly avoid pain, we can and do reduce and eliminate some of the needless suffering in our world. So that's one thing we can do. But there's still going to be unavoidable suffering. So what do we do with that? And what I'm going to talk about is how we might turn that into transformative suffering. And the way I'll introduce my thoughts is with the serenity prayer. You've all heard it. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So what I want to talk about is how we can have excellence in suffering. And I'll talk about that through the virtues of compassion, courage, and practical wisdom. And those follow directly from the serenity prayer. So the first virtue that goes with suffering is compassion. And I see compassion as a virtue in that it needs to show up in behavior. We have to understand what we're doing. We have to have cognitive awareness and knowledge about how to be compassionate. Our emotions need to be consistent with compassion. So it's not good enough to offer aid to someone if we really don't want to, or if we're just doing it for an ulterior motive. We want our motivation, our emotion to be consistent with the experience of compassion. And it also, we want it to be habitual. We want it to come naturally that we offer compassion. And now the first thing to notice about compassion is that it's painful. And the reason it's painful is that when we feel compassion for others, we recognize that we're all in the same boat. We're just as vulnerable as they are. The old saying, there but for the grace of God go I, acknowledges this. And so we realize that we're as vulnerable as anyone else. Secondly, we recognize our connection to others because we're in the same boat. And this is something that's strangely absent from a lot of the psychology of compassion, is that it's mostly about connection. That calm in compassion is about connection. We're experiencing emotions and suffering with someone else. And we want to cultivate that compassion into a habit and into a way of life. The second one, courage, is also well known as a virtue. And this comes up because needless or unjust suffering frequently induces outrage and leads us to confront power. There's been a great deal of this in the last couple of years in particular. If we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, there's a lot of confrontation of inequities and bias in our society. And that confronts directly the people who are in power. But the reason that people are willing to do this and do this courageously and do this with excellence is that they're facing their fears of this power to protect the rights and possibilities of people who need that protecting. So courage is always a matter of protecting something that is truly worthwhile. It's never a matter of just taking risks. Finally, practical wisdom is the ability to recognize what's important in a situation and to act accordingly. So practical wisdom is a matter of moral perception. Do we understand what's really happening? Are we able to guide our actions according to what's really important in a situation and according to our moral aims, what it is to live a good life? So I have more to say about that, but I'm going to skip forward to my conclusion so that I don't run out of time completely and take someone else's time. So the first conclusion is, number one, we can't escape suffering, but we can suffer well and for the right reasons. And virtue theory provides us with the resources of understanding the virtues of compassion, courage, and practical wisdom. And we want to relinquish the pursuit of invulnerability for the sake of our shared humanity. And if you take one thing away from this talk, it's this: that human beings flourish in and through vulnerability rather than despite it. It offers us opportunities to embrace our full humanity, and that's what we really want to work toward, rather than trying to avoid the pain of vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fowers. And now we're going to move on to Dr. Narvaez.
Hello, thank you for having me here, Paul, and nice to be with everyone. My focus is on the baselines for vulnerability, and I think it's important to establish what's normal for our species based on deep history, rather than the narrow slice of humanity usually studied, and who typically are not raised in a species typical manner. Every life form is vulnerable, but Homo sapiens evolved particular ways to address their vulnerability, such as group living, cooperative child raising, and sharing. Among primates, only humans share widely. Among non-capitalist societies, sharing is universal. Humanity spent 99% of its existence as nomadic foragers, and they share virtually everything, shocking the explorers and the anthropologists who encountered them. Their sharing is not a market exchange. It's not reciprocity. Instead, there's an unevenness in resource sharing, with some giving more and some receiving more, such as food, attention, and care, and in a communalistic culture. In fact, humanity evolved with a maternal gift economy, where mothers within a cooperative supportive community unilaterally initially gave their bodies to infants and children who were not capable of reciprocating. Moreover, matrifocal societies, dominant among First Nation communities prior to colonization, live with relational interdependency, dependent on sharing and on nature's gift economy. The need for care is understood to be universal. So I see this as a baseline for our species. Within these caring relationships, the individual responds to the needs and fragilities of others, at the same time acknowledging their own fragility and their need for care. In reviewing ethnographic studies, anthropologist Thomas Whitlock suggested that one learns to be a self from being embedded in a sharing community. Sharing culture supports a sense of finiteness, limited by others, a sense of dependence on others because of one's finiteness. Sharing of care begins in babyhood, when a baby in traditional societies is provided with our species' evolved nest. That includes soothing birth, breastfeeding, extensive affection from multiple responsive caregivers, play in the natural world, and so on. This fosters, as we know now from interdisciplinary research, including neuroscience, the nest supports health and resilience. And it allows the child to learn to receive and thereby thrive, but also to let go into sleep, for example, with confidence, from being constantly carried in the arms of responsive caregivers. The ongoing presence and nest provision by caregivers assures a well-functioning neurobiology that supports the development of a deep sociality and a confidence in being dynamically alive. The individual builds a sense of self and relationship, understanding that the self is formed by relationship, by mutual dependence. A sense of vulnerability and neediness of self and others is salient in the sharing community, where humility is a virtue. Throughout life, then, the individual learns the skills of sharing to let go, no matter the circumstance, whether abundant or in want. In this capacity, stunned European explorers who noted how native peoples on multiple continents shared what food they had with them, strangers, even if the group was hungry. Within these communities, sharing accrues over the lifetime, culminating in the ability to be able to let go of what one accumulates and ultimately to let go of one's life itself. In other words, this is Whitlock, a person can be said to die for others, their death a reminder of finiteness. Whitlock says, sharing in the form of allowing others access to skills, knowledge, and positions also invokes the notion of replacement and of giving up space for others, ultimately by giving up one's own life and by making room for others. In contrast, the European individualistic culture that developed in the last few centuries expects selfishness, not sharing, and hoarding, not letting go. And our child raising practices generate then emotional conditioning of shame, fear, anger, and artificial guilt that renders its members susceptible to multiple imbalances, such as automatically subordinating themselves to respected authorities, and believing the cultural myths of individualism, hierarchy, and authoritarianism as normal, and the sense of superiority of human beings and separation from nature. So these are really reflective of the loss of right hemisphere dominated capacities that our society since the ancient Greeks has led us to. And so I also talk about culture-induced emotions. When we discuss emotion, we must be cautious again about understanding which emotions are species typical and which are shaped by culture. Mammalian emotions have been mapped by neuroscientists. As mammals, we have innate emotion systems for fear, anger, panic, and grief that are conditioned up or down in early life. Other mammalian emotion systems are innately prepared, but must be fostered through experience after birth. Those are caring or love and play. Feelings of shame and guilt are not represented in our neurobiological emotion systems, but are culturally based. In hierarchical civilizations, the last 1% of human existence, babies are typically not provided our species' evolved nest. That is, they're under-cared for. And when a baby's signals are not recognized or responded to, the baby will experience shame. If this occurs routinely, the child will learn to shut down their self-development in terms of self-trust, trust of the world, and intuition development. And when they're corporally punished, shame also results. Most of human existence was spent in nomadic foraging communities where there isn't shame-inducing treatment at all. Fear, basic fear is a basic emotional system we share with other animals. Native peoples work with normal fear to use it courageously for growth. However, again, civilized nations intentionally induce fear, existential fear in young children, purposefully leaving them alone or in distress due to beliefs in children's evil nature, the corresponding desire to break the child's spirit, belief in that babies need to be taught independence from caregivers, or that how one treats a baby doesn't matter in the long term. All these things are untrue. The science is showing us. Routine fear and distress in babyhood create toxic early stress, which has long-term negative effects. It also shapes epigenetics and immune system and all sorts of systems, leading to worse outcomes. And in civilized societies, adults often use fear to manipulate children, but also the adults who are stress reactive. And leaders know how to trigger those fears and anxieties in adults to control them. Then there's guilt. We have artificial guilt. Well, primitive guilt happens when one realizes that one's actions cause harm to the natural world or another person, and so you resolve not to do that again. That's a preventive guilt, common everywhere. But artificial guilt is associated with civilized societies, a self-denigrating, punitive guilt. Like shame and induced fear, artificial guilt comes from the coercion, punishment, and undercare that babies and young children experience in civilized societies. So the emotions of shame, fear, and guilt we observe in weird populations really doesn't represent our baseline. It's not normal for our species. But we need to heal these things, and it takes lots of therapy in adulthood to work through them after a childhood of this kind. So in conclusion, to return to the acceptance and honoring of species-typical vulnerability an awareness of the fragility of humans and other than humans. Several cultural shifts are needed. Here are a couple of them. We need to restore the evolved nest to young children. We need to restore the nestedness of all of us throughout life to foster our capacities that have been either missing or suppressed in dominator cultures like our own. And we must understand that communalism, attending to basic needs, should be central to a society's purpose. For more information, see our website, evolvednest.org. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Narvaez. Now we'll move on to Dr. Mayer.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul, for inviting me to the symposium, and also thanks very much to all of the speakers before. And I think I can actually connect very well to Darcia and what you've just said. I'm talking about transforming vulnerabilities and shame during the pandemic. And I'm going to talk about a little case study from a non-weird sample, and this could actually really contribute maybe something to what has been said before. So when we are looking at shame, shame is a very important emotion, as you have already heard, and it is often perceived as very negative. It impacts on thoughts, on our behavior, on social interactions, and as we have just heard, it is built up in early childhood already. In many cultures, shame is a taboo topic, and it is stored in the unconscious. The aim of my short talk today is giving some insights on how to deal with vulnerability caused through shame in a therapeutic setting within the South African context, and also giving insight into how to transform shame maybe in the one or the other way. When we are looking at shame, it makes us really vulnerable, and since it connects to others and ourselves, and to our shadow sides. We've heard this many times before. And shame can wound our inner being, in particularly when it is not recognized, acknowledged, or transformed for individual growth and development. The transformation of vulnerability, pain, and suffering from the wound of shame is actually very important. And it is done through creating awareness, reflection, acknowledging it and our vulnerabilities, transforming our thoughts, but also our mindsets, our cultural approaches to it, our actions towards fostering self-growth and resilience and flourishing. Because shame makes us so vulnerable, it is often unconsciously suppressed and not talked about. It makes us vulnerable because it connects to our unpleasant qualities we might have, others might see in us, the unconscious contents of our personality, or the functions which are insufficiently developed. Shame is a topic that is often revealed in therapy, although it might not be the first topic people come to us into therapy, but we can work with it then when it occurs. Interventions to manage and transform shames have been described previously, and also during the past years, we see a huge increase in working with shame and vulnerability, and exploring shame and therapy as well, because we have seen in research that it really increases, and Paul has said this before, meaningfulness, holistic health, and well-being in individuals. When we are looking at shame and therapy, we are aiming at creating consciousness of shame and therapy, recognizing it through our work, through the negative, working through negative aspects, through pain, suffering, and vulnerability, becoming aware and conscious about it, exploring it in depth, and in the end, seeing the positive side of it by asking certain questions, such as what thoughts make you vulnerable, which behavior do you display when you feel hurt? How can you transform this behavior to getting to the more positive side of it? What is the general development potential from your vulnerability and shame? But also through questions like what develops from the negative feeling of shame? What develops within yourself, but also within the system that surrounds you? I would like to come to a short case study of transforming shame in the South African context during COVID-19, because we have worked a lot in a voluntary network with healthcare workers during the past 1.5 years in the South African context, and this is one of the cases we've dealt with. One healthcare worker experienced the death of her father during the first weeks of COVID-19 lockdown in South Africa, and that was quite a strict lockdown because we were supposed not to leave our homes for over 6 weeks. The client is a 62-year-old female client. She's Afrikaans speaking. She's a South African citizen, and she's belonging to the cultural group of the Coloureds from the Western Cape in South Africa, which is the major tourist destination usually in South Africa. She's married, has no children, and she has been working in the healthcare system for over 20 years. First of all, when she came to the first sessions, and usually you've got a few sessions which you can just attend being a healthcare worker in South Africa without paying anything for it, but as a service of the psychologists in South Africa. We started with the sessions, and she actually said she's coming because of her fear and her anxiety because of COVID-19, and because she was overweight at that point in time. She really felt very threatened going to work and working in the context as a frontline worker. So she had these overwhelming feelings of loss and grief and also burnout at work, and she didn't want to go to work anymore because she was so scared seeing what was happening and working through all the loss of her colleagues as well. So we recognized the pain and the suffering and the vulnerability through her crying, through extreme stress levels, taking time off from work as well, and also feeling ashamed of taking the time for herself. And then we also looked at the acknowledgement of the loss of her father 8 months ago, when she lost the father after the first weeks of the lockdown. And she actually experienced a kind of traumatization and re-traumatization every time somebody at work and in the hospital context passed on. And she experienced this same feeling of pain and suffering and loss of her father every time this happened again at work, and she felt she could not go to work anymore. However, when she came into the therapy, she was not really aware and conscious of this fact that it was a kind of re-traumatizing effect for her. And during the sessions, we tried to look at the different topics that were coming up easily for her first, like working as a healthcare worker during COVID-19, what is really happening, how can we transform really the loss and the pain and the suffering. However, we couldn't move there quickly, but we really had to work through the suffering and pain. But also other existential issues from her life history and her life circles came up. And one of the big issues of shame that were connected to COVID-19 and the losses was actually her overweight, and how she felt as a woman in this profession, being so overweight and big as she described herself, and being actually part of the risk group in the pandemic, what she didn't want to be. So the vulnerable and feelings and feeling ashamed of her personal losses and even of her father made her feeling very ashamed, and she connected it in the sessions often to the trauma she experienced with a lot of loss she had experienced earlier in her life with regard to people dying of HIV and AIDS. So we explored all of her thoughts and feelings, her whole mindset about losing people in her life due to these kind of viruses. Then we went on and we explored deeper, and we explored her losses of colleagues, the working of overtime, the stress, and so on, and also the feelings of shame with regard to her own concepts of living and dying, and the meaning of life, and being ashamed of questioning her job, and the question even, would she rather move out of the profession and not contributing to others being able to go on with their lives anymore. So this was a huge part of the shame she felt, because she felt as if she's leaving her colleagues behind and she's actually moving into a new direction. And then we also looked at her whole body shame and how it connects to COVID-19 and the losses, but also then to the death of the father and how to transform it. Just moving on to the transformational aspect, we used two interventions. And the one was working with symbols of strength. looking really at what kind of symbols came up in her mind, working with shame and transforming it. And for her, it was the tree of life that came up quite quickly in the intervention. And we worked a lot with this symbol through all of the other sessions and what it meant to her and how to transform all of her shame. And the second tool we actually used was the externalization of the wound of shame, working through shame and asking questions like, how does shame look? What gender does it have? What color? How does it transform when we work with it? How does it transform when we are looking at the pain and the suffering that it causes? How should it actually look? And we worked a lot of time onto this transformation and moving forward. So asking about the growth factor, the development of the symbol of shame, I wanted to show it to you because she was drawing it. It was a green little figure. And then in conclusion, what really came out is that we talked a lot in the therapy, but the talking about the shame wouldn't really transform the shame and the vulnerability. But what really helped were the symbols in the end to transform it in an image. And the externalization, sending the little green monster onto vacation and asking it, how does it feel being on vacation, and how does it feel not, to feel it in daily life situations. So really working with shame in this context of COVID-19 helped her later on to go back to work, at least, still feeling a kind of burnout, but still working on the growth factor still. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Mayer. And so now we have Dr. Paul Wong to come back on screen, and we'll lead, and we will start the discussion for a round of concluding comments.
I don't have any more to say, just quick and answer.
Okay. So a round of concluding comments from all panelists. And so, Paul, do you have anything to say? Any questions?
How can we be compassionate while being principled?
Compassionate. Okay. Anyone can answer?
How can we be compassionate while being principled?
No. Blaine, your area.
Sure, yeah, I can respond to that. I think that, well, as I said, I think that compassion is a very important virtue, one that we would all be wise to cultivate. And it can be difficult. I'm taking the question to be, how can we be compassionate toward people with whom we disagree, or people with whom we're enemies or opponents? And I think it's especially important in that case. This is not so much a Christian point of view, but one that as human beings, we live on the same planet. We live in the same society, sometimes in the same households. And one of the things we can do in order to be compassionate is to try very hard to understand why someone takes the perspective that they do. Why are they non-compliant with the vaccine? Why are they opposing equal rights for people or voting rights or something like that? And I think that that's the pathway toward building bridges and building commonality, finding common ground. And I think it's really essential that we do that. And in our polarized society, it's a terrible shame that we can't talk to each other much about important things. And I think compassion is one pathway to get to that.
Is suffering a necessity for flourishing and deeper meaning?
Anyone want to answer? Piers, you want to answer that?
Let me say how touched I am by everybody's contribution. I think, but to me, what it's illustrated is the nuances across the whole spectrum of what vulnerability might mean. Forgive me, I may be indirect in my answer. I'm saying I think vulnerability is appropriate, needed. It's a process and a skill in all of life. So including the suffering, including the challenging, and yet it's needed in everyday interactions, care, expressions of care. So I would say it's the whole spectrum, not just suffering.
Any more questions? Okay, I want to thank everybody for your ideas. So basically, we are all human beings. We are all vulnerable. That's why we need each other and we need God. That is true 300,000 years away in a cave. They worship God, they get together. It's still true today. We need each other and we need God. Thank you. Thank you for your together.
Thank you to all panelists.
Okay, listen. Have you got what then? It's show time.
Okay, we know. Okay, bye, Paul.
Pleasure being with you all.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Piers.
You too.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again, Darcia.
We'll meet again. Thank you.
We'll be turning the meeting. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
To find where the treasure lies. I want to hear that small voice whisper to my forgotten soul. They say it's never too late to start again. What breaks your heart will make